another podcast here, and I think we have a pretty exciting one for people that enjoy history, and because it's really a momentous one. I know we kind of alluded to it in our prior podcast about Eisenhower's speech. That now we're going to cover Kennedy's American University speech. It's also titled "A Strategy of Peace," and it's one of his most well-known speeches of all time. Actually, one of the most famous presidential speeches of all time. So, John F. Kennedy was our, I don't want to get him wrong, 35th president of the United States. This speech was done on June 10th, 1963, and really is just a momentous speech about sort of laying out a hopeful, realistic route for world peace at a time when the U.S. and the Soviet Union faced potential for escalating nuclear arms race. And that really was the fear at the time, is that either the Soviet Union or the U.S. would launch a nuclear weapon, and it would just be a cascading effect where it would just be mutually assured annihilation. So this speech really focuses on the importance of education and how he believes that you have to look at the other side, the other perspective, being the Russian perspective, to really de-escalate the situation. So very powerful speech, and definitely excited about sharing it with everybody here today.
Yeah. So a little bit that I can add to that, because it was on my mind. So this speech took place right after the Cold War. So a lot of tension with Russia. Most people know the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was kind of the gap in time following the Cold War, and then Andrew and I were talking before the podcast because I'm terrible at dates, but right before the Vietnam, before we got involved with all that. So, yeah, I think that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can get into, but I know, Andrew, the last podcast that we did on Eisenhower's speech, there was a really good segment that we wanted to talk about with government spending.
Yeah.
Do you want to preface before we get into
Sure.
the nitty gritty with that?
With that, sure, yeah. Well, let me get into a little bit of the early parts of Kennedy's speech. So, and then I'll kind of lead into that and
Okay.
put out the website for viewers, because I think it's definitely worth any American, actually anybody worldwide should check out our budget, but especially Americans, because you want to know where our tax dollars are being spent. And it was an eye opener for me. I thought I had an idea, but once I started digging into some of the numbers, it's pretty astounding. And it also ties into with some of Ray Dalio's points as well about government spending and debt. So we definitely have some interesting points to point out there. So Kennedy sort of prefaces this speech as with the ideas that a university is really a beautiful place. It's a place where people who hate ignorance go, right? It's a place where people, I'll just use his words, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. So he then goes on to say it's a place to discuss, he's choosing this time and place to discuss a topic which ignorance too often abounds and truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, is peace. And he's then goes on and he's talking about a genuine peace, not the peace of a slave, not the peace of quiet, weak people, but a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. And so he sort of lays in the importance of indirectly investing in education and the importance of universities, and not to look at universities and their beautiful high towers and their beautiful campuses, but to really focus on what is a university really providing. It's education. It's taking ignorance out of people and making them more well-rounded so that we can have a peaceful and just society for our generation and for future generations. Um, so with that being said, and it kind of also ties into, like I said earlier, Ray Dalio's understanding of like what superpowers do. We take on debt, and we invest a ton of money in our military. So I suggest all viewers go to, I just don't want to get it wrong. Oh, I've saved it in Eisenhower's speech. USAspending.gov. So it's a government website that essentially lays out year by year all of our budget and what we spent in total. So per USA.gov, in 2023, the US plans to spend $6.09 trillion. So just about $6 trillion in 2023. Of that, the large pieces, 156 billion is going to be spent on Medicare, 154 billion on Social Security, 905 billion on national defense. So almost a trillion in each one of those categories. A trillion on Medicare, a trillion on Social Security, and nearly a trillion on national defense. So that includes the military, border security, but mostly the military and the military industrial complex. Then we obviously haven't heeded Kennedy's words, because our education department, we spend $86 billion on our education department. So that is literally 1/10 of what we spend on our military. So we clearly haven't, heeded, Kennedy's advice and Eisenhower's advice about being careful about spending too much on our military industrial complex. And we really should be investing in education. We're falling behind in STEM, science, technology, forgetting the other one. What's the E stand for? M is mathematics.
Engineering?
It might be engineering. I think it is.
I was going to say
engineering.
education, but I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
that so we're falling behind in those categories, and those are the future job producers and where the jobs are going to be for the future. So I think whoever owns those STEM is a powerhouse with those STEM essentially courses,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be a leader into the future. And then the most interesting thing that I kind of peeled away from USA spending.gov is that we spend 9% of our budget, or projected to spend 9% of our budget, on interest alone. And the interest on our debt is $545 billion. So we spend almost
Jeez.
$1 in $10 that the government's spending is just servicing the interest on our debt. It's not paying down debt. It's just servicing the interest. So if one of us has a credit card and we have $5,000 on that card and they charge us 20% interest, 1/10 of what we make is just going to pay that
That's
interest.
disgusting.
And to put that in relation, I mean, 545 billion. I'll just get the exact number because I don't want to estimate here. So 545 billion divided by what we spend on the education department. So we spend 6.33 times more on our interest payment to service our debt than we do on our education system at a federal level. So it's quite absurd. And, I just thought that was an interesting thing to point out. It was something I also wanted to point out during Eisenhower's speech and bring that up, but because I, just didn't. Kennedy's speech is a good way to start it, and especially because it is to a graduating class, in the DC area, and it's a university where a lot of the students will go into public policy and work for the government.
Mm-hmm.
So it really lends itself to a future generation. But obviously the mechanisms in place that weren't strong enough. Kennedy alone wasn't strong enough to to make it possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to pull up, and I'll share my screen here because this kind of ties into everything that we've. This is literally everything that we've talked about on the podcast
Mm-hmm.
so far. So this ties in with Ray Dalio's book. This ties in with Eisenhower's speech, and it will lead into Kennedy's speech. But um, just to before I show this, like that one of the things that we discussed back in Ray Dalio's book was like, how do we set America up and the world up in a sense for a better future? And part of that is like we need to get our spending under control so that we get
Yep.
out of this detrimental debt cycle that we're in. And part of that may involve raising taxes. And it's interesting because you often forget, like you hear all of the money that the government spends, and it's easy to forget that us as Americans working and making wages, like we're paying for that. Like it comes out of our taxes. And so enough rambling. I will share my screen. But this happened. So this for anyone listening to this too. We're at the end of July. This is about a month ago. I don't know when this podcast will come out. I don't know when you'll be listening to it. So it may be older news, I guess, at that point. But this is a article that was written up. This is the PBS article in particular, but it says a Pentagon says accounting error provides extra $6.2 billion for Ukraine military aid. So we're funding the Ukraine. We've provided a lot of funding for them, not only in military service, but in intel and like military strategy and stuff like that. But essentially, part of whoever handles like the these bills that get passed and the not the compensation, but like the what's the word I'm looking for, Andrew? Need help?
Spending,
Yeah, just like
resource
the aid.
allocation.
Yeah, the aid, the resources and stuff that we provide them. They had an accounting error that gave an extra $6.2 billion to the Ukraine that wasn't supposed to go there. And it just they don't even really. I mean, you can I guess read on about it if you want. I don't want to spend the whole podcast talking about it, but it doesn't even seem like they really care. Like no one in the government issued like a public apology. No one really even made mention of it. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, whoops, we accidentally sent a 6.2 billion accidentally
Dollars.
in an accounting error in military aid. There is another article that I can share here too that I don't have access to Bloomberg, but I wish I had an account here, but it says accounting error allows for more arms for Ukraine. And so yeah, this just ties into it. So we're talking about the military industrial complex, and we're talking about servicing our debt, and it's like it makes you feel, I'd feel better about paying taxes and paying more taxes if I knew where that money was going and I knew that it was going to be handled appropriately and that it was actually going to lead to good and better things for the country.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thought that this was interesting because it's like as we're talking about all these speeches and we're talking about where we're at in the debt cycle, all of these presidents that are warning about military industrial complex and basically mishandling with government and civilian or private corporations, and then you see this come up in the news where it's like we accidentally sent an extra $6.2 billion to the Ukraine, which is just going to allow them to buy more military equipment, and it's a kind of a as good of an example as you can get of
Yeah.
all of these things we're talking about happening in real time.
Yeah, that's quite absurd. Yeah, that's the problem is you're talking such big numbers. I mean, even when I'm pointing out, $900 billion in, Medicare spending, and it's just the numbers are just so astronomical, but it's real people's money, like and that $6 billion could be well invested in, communities across this country. As
I was just
well.
gonna
So
I was just gonna say, like, what happens if you took that 6 billion and gave it to the education, just as you were talking about? I mean, that'd make a huge difference.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Relieve some of the suffering that we have internally, right? And I think a big part of that is to invest in education. Like I'm just a big proponent in learning. I mean, that's part of what we're doing with this podcast is just like, let's learn, let's become like well-rounded, informed citizens, right? Um, we don't have a calculated agenda, um, but we just want to learn, and we want to learn from history, and a lot of these figures, I feel like a lot of times with history, and I think I've said this before, is that we tend to think that like history is in a vacuum and we know what happened, right? We know the sequence of events, but the reality is when people are going through it, they don't know. So it's very important to listen to the words that people are saying. Like Kennedy didn't know that there wasn't going to become a nuclear war, in the next 5, 10 years. Like we didn't know the status of what was going to really transpire. And these were really trying times, right? And so I think it's important to put that into context and really listen to what people say and take in advice from smart people who have seen a lot. So I think that's one of our goals of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think Kennedy's speech is really is a beautiful speech in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And he takes self responsibility for things. I mean, he goes on to say throughout his speech, like the problems that we face today are man made, therefore they can be solved by man. And I think we have to have that approach with our government and what we do, right? So like if we're having a problem, if we're late on our debt cycle, right? The problem is we've made it. So we have an ability to fix that problem, and we need to get ahead of our problems. Um, I know too. We're gonna eventually talk about like Jordan Peterson's book, and I think Jordan Peterson's a big proponent of that concept. Is like take ownership of yourself, take ownership of your actions, and um, start with yourself internally, and before you start focusing on the world outside. So part of what we're doing is we're learning, right, and we're trying to figure out how we can solve our internal problems to make our individual lives better, and in the process just try to share that knowledge with other people. um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was a great way to put it. And it helps, like, when you look at the current events and stuff like that, you can, just like we did now, you can start
Yeah.
to piece together an understanding of like, okay, like why is it important? Well, there's a debt cycle that's taking place, and our country is getting to a point where it may lose its, world reserve currency status, and we may default on our debt, and like debt may need to be restructured, and that's
Yeah.
not good for people here. So it's like you're following that, and then you're kind of understanding when you see how money's being mismanaged too, like how it's
Yep.
happening, and it gives you a better understanding, and it gives you like it gives your voice more power because you're educated on it and you can speak to it intelligently. um,
Exactly.
there's also, like, I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but as I was reading through this article, apparently this is a second round that this happened. So there
Jeez.
was, I mean, it's kind of a little like outrageous, but it says the Pentagon reported in late June that it overestimated the value of the weapons it supplied to Ukraine by a whopping 6.2 billion over the past 2 years. The revelation came just 4 weeks after the Pentagon initially admitted to an accounting error of at least 3 billion, about half the current estimate. Lawmakers have been pressing the Department of Defense to ensure the funds don't get diverted into the wrong hands or become subject to fraud. Like, what does that even mean? Like,
I
I
know
don't
there's
know.
like a government accountability office, essentially like accountants for the government, but I mean, not to talk any crap about, government employees, but
I
I
don't
don't
know.
know. There might
But
not
it's just
be
it's just a good thing to be aware of.
yeah, no, and mismanagement is like it's not okay, right? Like we need to
Yeah.
hold, and the thing is that's scary about it is nobody's going to probably be held accountable for that, and but so I think that is important. Like we as informed citizens need to hold the government accountable, right? We make up the government in a way, right? Because we vote, we have a democracy, but we need to make sure that we're informed so that we're making good decisions. So like when you hear political candidates speak, like, ask them these questions and try to get an understanding, and start even at more local community. Make sure your own little community in wherever you live has a sound budget, is operating fiscally responsibly. Like those are important things um, to ensure. right?
Hmm.
So,
Definitely.
I think that's a great article, honestly.
Yeah, it's
um,
just.
yeah. And I mean, going back to Kennedy's speech, and another like beautiful thing about it, and we kind of alluded to it before, is that he focuses on re-examining America's attitude towards the Soviet Union. So it's, again, it's inward reflection, and that's what's such like a beautiful speech. Why this speech is so beautiful, because it's like, it's saying like, hey, America, let's wake up, let's look at ourselves, look at how we're a part of the problem, right? If there's two adversaries, if anybody's fighting, it takes two people to fight, right? And we need to look inward and try to understand and empathize with the other person. I think that's important, no matter um what you're doing in life. Even if you see somebody at work and they're having a bad day, or they're mean or a little bit like obnoxious about something, you got to question like what's going on in their life. They must feel pretty shitty if they're going to act that way or be in a crappy mood. Um and you don't always know what's going on behind closed doors. So a little bit of a tangent, but Kennedy essentially goes on to explain. um I'm going to see if I can find it. He essentially actually hails the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space and economic and industrial growth and culture and acts of courage. Um, and he goes on to really empathize with the Soviet Union and the people of Russia. As he states, no nation in history of battle has ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including nearly two-thirds of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. So, I mean, put that in perspective. I mean, could you imagine from Chicago eastwards, like our entire country pretty much got wiped out, the entire economy? And that's what happened to the Russians. And the Russians are afraid, after suffering that huge defeat, they're afraid, even into today's world, um, about Western encroachment on their sphere of influence, right? Um, I mean, he does ridicule Russia a lot in many ways, and he says like we look at communism as like an abhorrent system. It's not good for the average person. People don't have a voice. It takes away a person's soul, essentially, living under a regime like that. But that's still not enough like reason to not empathize with the person and the people, because at the end of the day, we're all people and we share a lot more commonalities than differences. And I think a president, like, I can't tell you a president in my lifetime that has empathized with another set of people like he has in this speech. I mean, I don't know. In my lifetime, I've thought about like Bush and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't understand the people. We didn't understand the culture. It's pretty evident in how those wars turned out. Um, Obama maybe a little bit more empathetic. And then we get into Trump. He's pretty much a isolationist and pick fights across the world. And Biden, and we kind of know he's a little more of sort of a puppet for the Democratic Party in general. So I mean, just for somebody who's young, who's seen the horrors of war as well, I think that's also important to point out. Like, Kennedy was in World War II. He was, I think he was a patrol boat officer, and he was actually injured in the Pacific Theater. He suffered some back injuries, and I know he was awarded um, some heroic medals for his service. I think he actually like swam to shore and like rescued people. Um, I don't know the whole story, but that's another thing to actually like look up, and I think is really important to you know this guy was a real war hero. So he understood the horrors of war, and I don't think people today understand the horrors of war. We're so disconnected from it. with social media, and we don't get all the truth. And I think it's so important to be aware. Like, we need to avoid war at all costs. It doesn't do good for anyone or anything, um, except for maybe the military industrial complex. So I think we got to be aware of that too.
No, I think that's um I think you hit the nail on the head with that. The one thing I was gonna add to um, add to that is not only have our presidents not like empathized with other countries and other world powers, but they fail to empathize with each other. Like there's
Yeah,
America, everybody's saying it. I mean, everybody knows that America is more divided than arguably than it's ever been. It's definitely the most divided it's been since I've been alive. Um, and you have like neither party, Trump's never going to do it, Biden's never going to do it. They're so worried about being right and sticking to like making sure that their side wins,
hmm,
um that they just keep put like it's like this I don't know, it's like an internal combustion that's about to explode. And what we really need in a world leader, right, or in a in a president right now, is somebody who's gonna like just get up and be and empathize, like whether they're on the right or the left, whatever, just empathize with the
yeah,
other side and say, hey, look, I understand, whatever the point is. I know multiple sides have or both sides have multiple points, but whatever it is, like just empathize with them, try to communicate. That's what we need right now. But what
yeah,
the way that we're going, we're just gonna rip ourselves, um, to
yeah,
pieces. It's
yeah. And there's something to be said about like the greatest generation. So I forget who coined that term. I know there is a book. I don't know if it was actually Tom Brokaw who coined that term or not. But he wrote like a fantastic book about different people in World War II. Essentially, the people of World War II that did amazing things. They sacrificed tremendously for this country. They came back, home, and went into government, went into politics, were able to go into businesses, and they really helped the country to become the superpower it became. And I think I don't want to glorify war, but I do want to glorify what these people learned from it and the appreciation they garnered from um, the war, and losing people and losing friends. And they came back very appreciative, and realized the importance. Like, at the end of the day, we're all Americans. At the end of the day, we need to reach across the aisle and come to an understanding and talk to each other. And I think that's something that's missed in today's political world. We need to talk more. Um, so I think that's a really important point, and that's also a really good book for people to purchase and read. It's Tom Brokaw's book, and there's small chapters that focus on just different individuals and sort of their life, and a synopsis of sort of their accomplishments in life. And it's a beautifully written book,
mm-hmm.
and it's really inspiring. And it also makes me think. I'm gonna try to get my wife to lead me to I wanted to watch, because the other night, it wasn't, well, this months ago, I watched Saving Private Ryan again. And I was first just was gonna watch a little bit of it, and then before I know it, I'm like all hooked, right? And it's just a beautiful, beautiful movie. And I forget exactly how the ending works, but essentially, um, what's his name's character? Who's the main actor now? I'm forgetting.
Spoiler alert for people.
Yeah, spoiler. Geez, he's a huge actor.
In
Um,
Saving Private Ryan,
yeah,
who's in that
Tom
movie?
Hanks.
Yeah, Tom Hanks and
Ryan.
Matt Damon played in that.
Yeah, ending.
Vin Diesel was in that.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, yeah. He got shot. Oh,
No.
so at the end, um, essentially, Tom Hanks' character dies at the end. If nobody's watched the movie, I mean, if you haven't seen the movie and you're an American, shame on you. My wife's from Brazil, so she hasn't seen the movie, so I wanted to watch it. But it really like puts life in perspective. I remember after finishing it, I was like, wow, like the problems I have are like non-existent. Like these guys went over there, they freaking fought for something, you know. They ended this tyranny that the Nazi regime brought to Europe and the destruction and the horrors. And these men and women died to stop that, and it's just a beautiful thing. And at the end, Tom Hanks's character says to Matt Damon's character, Private Ryan, um, he pulls him close and with his dying breath says, "Earn this, earn this." I think we need to all recognize that. Like we all need to live in the memory of these people that sacrificed for our country and to make it a beautiful place. And we all need to look internally and earn what we have. And we need to earn the democracy that that past generations fought for. It's so important. And again, that's why we're doing this podcast. Become educated, become informed citizens. It's what the founding fathers wanted of the populace, and it's important for all people to do. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just remember watching the movie and just having that thought process, and
Mhm.
it all kind of fits into play because Kennedy was a World War II veteran, and he was able to reach across the aisle and knew the importance of empathizing with others, um, and I, he was really a beautiful president, and it's a shame that he was assassinated shortly after this speech.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think empathy and empathizing with others is huge, and it's critical if we're gonna get out of this. And just listening to people, right? Like listening
Yeah,
and really trying to understand what they have to say, um not concocting in your mind like what you think they're saying because they're not saying exactly what you want them to say.
to say.
Like that's a big thing because there's not things aren't life is not black and white, and opinions aren't black and white. It's not like you're on the left or you're on the right. Like you can be in the middle, and you can have you can have uh, like a broad view on life, and they right now, perfect example, and we've talked about it a number of times on the podcast. Like you and I are both big Second Amendment supporters. We enjoy shooting. We like it as a sport, and it's like the amount of people in the world that would, if they had a conversation with us, would automatically put us in a very particular bucket and be like,
Yeah,
"You guys
box.
are, you know, crazy conservatives and you know." MAGA
Yeah,
supporters and this and that. It's like, no, not really. I like to shoot guns. It's
or they lump us in the same category with mass murderers and
mm-hmm.
all sorts of disgusting people.
Yeah, and it's like, and that's a problem. Like when somebody, because of one specific characteristic or one interest or one opinion, it automatically you get dumped into this bucket. You're not listening to the person. You're not hearing that person for who they are. You're not taking the time to understand them
Yeah,
and to try to figure out what their thought process is, and maybe have conversations about other things that they're interested in, because and their opinions on other things, because maybe you'll find out that it's not so black and white. Um, that's really I've had that a lot in my life where I've been like categorized or lumped in and just, I don't know, basically branded as something that I'm not, just because of
right.
one particular opinion I have or one particular interest I have, and it's not fair and it's not right to do. Like just that's
Yeah.
not going to get us anywhere where we need to be. And um, I don't know that I know that's not exactly related, but
No,
to
it
JFK's
is.
to speech.
It
But
is.
that's, I mean, if you want to talk about peace and you want to get there, like you have to start empathizing and understanding and
Yep.
having conversations with your neighbors. Um, you know,
And people you don't agree with always.
yeah, and stop labeling and making assumptions all the time. I mean, that gets assumptions and labeling people without taking the time to truly understand them gets you absolutely nowhere. And you're not right. It's not like you can walk away and label somebody and have like this virtuous, and be like, oh yeah, nailed that one, because
Yeah.
like you're not. You're lying to yourself at that point, um and doing more harm than good. You could have probably walked away with a friend if you just took the time to converse with them, but you just, I don't know, kind of put your
Yeah.
fingers in your ears, wanted to believe what you wanted to believe, and then walked away. Um, probably angered yourself in the process, like like some sort of internal outrage. So I would guess.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no, I totally see what you're saying, and I mean, I think it's human nature, right? Like, I mean, even throughout this podcast so far, like I've labeled and probably said things that I probably shouldn't have, but you have to be open to ideas. You have to be open to, if you want to grow, you have to be open to changing and forming and developing a new opinion about things, right? And if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, gung ho for our military, and we're the right things. America's the right country, and we're doing great things. And I would have said we probably screwed up the wars a little bit, but I would have still had a lot of pride for our public policy and what we were doing on a global scale. And things change over time, right? As you get in more facts, as you start learning, as you start reading history, as you start learning reading documents, like you pulled up how we're literally just overspent like $6 billion for Ukraine funding. It's just it opens your eyes. It really does. It really, really
Yeah.
does.
I
Yeah.
think too, just to like clarify, I know you mentioned like we have made generalizations on the podcast and stuff like that. I don't really, and I know like that's, something we need to be careful of when we're talking and things like that. I'm not really talking about that so much because generalizations,
Hmm.
I feel like you kind of need to use them when you're talking about topics like this. Like it's impossible when you're talking about things on a broad macro level, it's impossible to get super granular. So you
Yeah.
have to have some sort of generalization, but I just meant more like when you're out at the bar at a restaurant, you're talking to other people. Like that's in that like intimate kind of conversation and those real personal, not when you're kind of broadly trying to describe a very complex, difficult subject that's not easy to explain anyway. Um,
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easier and almost necessary to lean on the generalizations more to make your point make sense. Otherwise, you can just kind of go
Go on
around and
for
around.
hours.
But I just meant more like when you're having your individual conversations and meeting people
Yeah.
in person and stuff. It's important to try to leave those behind.
Yeah. I get you there. Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and not be easily offended by what somebody else says that I disagree with, and try to just think of that. Like, okay, they said something I didn't like, but hey, if I want them to think how I think, it's good to be challenged, right? I think it's so important to be challenged on topics, and to be open to the challenge, right? But if you still think that your ideas are right, the best way to convince people to come into your camp is to be respectful, listen, and then offer a counter argument to them, right? In a respectful manner. Maybe they'll receive it, maybe they won't. But I think you gotta handle it that way. And at the end of the day, people are people. I feel like when people are a little bit more on a personal level, it's a little easier to communicate. Um, but sometimes, like on social media, or you read an article, like you don't get the truth about that person, it's very easy to slander them or say hurtful things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like really important. Like, step back, don't take all your news from social media. Like, try reading different news sources, try reading history, and read history from different perspectives too. I mean, we look a lot from a Western lens, but it's also important to look from other lenses as well, to just see how they're viewing the situation as well. um, so yeah, I think it's so important because at the end of the day, I mean, even Kennedy says, for in final analysis, our most basic common link, and he's talking about the world, is that we all inhabit this small planet, obviously the world.
Mm-hmm.
We breathe the same air, we cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Like, we're all gonna die, right? So what legacy do you want to leave behind? We want to leave a world that's bright for our future generation, for our children, and collectively all our children, right? Like, I want, if I have children directly, I want them to live in a world where other people's children are happy and successful and can breathe clean, safe, quality air. Um, and I think that's just another thing that's just so important. We're all unified, right? We really live in a global world, and we need to promote peaceful competition, and we need to care about each other and speak with one another, like as you said.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that, dude.
Yeah, that was almost good for an ending. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
go into anything
Well,
else.
we're 40 minutes in, so I got really nothing to add. There was one quick little snippet on here that I thought was pretty cool. That Kennedy said, and it's very short. It's
Mhm.
just like, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read um, a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there are very real threats of preventative that there is a very real threat of a preventive war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, yada, yada, yada. But the point of that, like the main takeaway, is just
Mhm.
re-examine our attitude. That's what stood out to me. I think
Yeah.
it ties into everything we talked about. It's just re-examine your attitude on it's both external on the way we view the world and internal. So
Yeah, no,
uh,
I think that's good. I do want to touch on one other thing before we
cool.
end.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Touch on it and then we'll wrap it up.
and towards the end of the speech, Kennedy talks about like let's re-examine again. He actually does say like let's examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home, right? Let's not focus so much on freedom of other people. Let people choose their way of life for themselves. Let's re-examine how we are doing things. Just like I was talking earlier, like fix your own home, fix your own attitude, fix your own actions. Um, it's so important to look in within, right? Um, so essentially, he says we must show the quality of our spirit. Um, we must show it in the dedication of our own lives. As many of you who are graduating today will have the unique opportunity to do so by serving without pay in the Peace Corps or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. Um, and so do some service, right? Like volunteer. Um, do some things like I mean, without dragging on too much, but like I'm actually like a big proponent. Like I wanted to do some more research too in this National Service Corps that he proposed is and I know he did get about like the Peace Corps as well. Um, do some service with your company if they offer volunteer hours. Like take care of other people, and because we we all deserve it for ourselves, and we need to promote democracy and just show that we care. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter what political party you're in. Like let's care for each other, and we owe it to our past generations for what they fought for, and we owe it to our future generations to provide them with um and you know I think that's a good way to end, and it's sort of how he sort of ends the speech himself. So yeah, and he does get into I'll hit one more thing. Um, he gets into the responsibility of government at the local, state, and national level, and it's to provide and protect freedom of all our citizens by all means within our authority. So make sure that our government is maximizing and providing freedom for all of us. And as soon as our government stops doing that, we need to hold our government accountable, and we need to become informed. So again, check out Kennedy's speech. It's a beautiful speech. Listen to it. It's about half an hour worth listening to. So, thanks everyone.